channel. We had a big meeting. A lot of the officers came to the table, and one stepped up to the plate, and that's what we need. Where there's a need, there will be an OSRO that fills the need.
Yeah, Matt?
Here's the question. You mentioned the high risk. And could you define that? Do they mean risk because of, you said something about winding, well, is it because of the driving conditions of the train? Or is it because there are some sensitive areas?
Yeah, can you zoom in on this one area right here? Just pick one.
It's statistical in nature too. 18% of the derailments are on 2% of the rail in the state.
Right, it has to do with grade, the grade that, or if it has to do with hairpin turns, it has to do with tracks that get undermined because of cliff subsiding. So it's mostly geography.
And environmental conditions.
And the way that the rails were laid down. Right.
So in your planning, what you need to do is really look at the risk and then look at the consequences of the risk. Just because that's a hazardous area, even if train derails and there are small consequences, then it's not.
Or no consequences to water.
Well, or no consequences. But there is some consequence, but if the consequence is not major, significant, this may be not a hazardous area somewhere else or sensitive area somewhere else.
Thank you for helping me.
Right.
That's exactly what it is.
So,
But the other part of that though, Matt, is that most of the time where you see those higher hazard areas is those very places where you have environmental risk, right? You see it at the Feather River, you see it at the Dunsmuir, you see it in Donner, because it's the very things that make those tracks hazardous that also often makes it a very interesting environmental place.
So that's why you have to look at the consequences. Of
So,
the risk.
Joy, can you capture sort of aligning risk as based by PUC and hazards as associated with environmental consequences?
so what I put up there is the hydrography layer. What you don't see a lot of times is a lot of the railroads, they follow the canyons, and a lot of times there are rivers associated with those canyons. And then I believe they were constructed that way because it's the path of least resistance, right?
Is that white line 80s? Is that what that
I don't know what that white line is.
Kinder Morgan.
So Chris has brought up a number of good points that also, one of the things we were going to cover this afternoon was pipeline and production facilities and our concepts having to do with reasonable worst case scope for them and those types of things. So again, mindful that you all wanted to provide time this afternoon since there's only a couple of people who weren't here from this morning, here this afternoon, none of them associated with industry. Do we want to move forward on that, or do you want to spend a little bit more time going over some of the concepts we've already laid out? So more time now? So not gonna work this time. So maybe we can move forward on production facilities and pipelines, and then see how those concepts may be similar or different to what we've done for rail, and then pick it up there. Okay, great.
True or false test. Department of Fish and Wildlife Office of Spill Prevention and Response is listed in the top 100 best companies to work for.
True.
No, it's false. Okay, we're gonna blast right through these here. Contingency plans, wow, isn't this funny? Same definitions. I draw your attention to the pipeline and the marine terminal. So this is just another new definition.
I don't see, do you consider
Production.
refinery to be a marine terminal, or?
They're an A.
They're an A, yeah.
They're A.
Yep, they're the ones
Even
that.
though it's in Bakersfield.
even those ones in Bakersfield, and we're gonna talk a little bit about that. Okay.
I got you.
And marine terminal.
No,
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, here's marine terminal. Okay, so what, the next one is something that we already talked about is waters of the state. Judd had a good point about this, a little discussion about waters of the state. And here's the definition, thoughts on waters of the state, dry creeks, dry washes, auroras. Those are the kind of things that we'd like to talk about with you folks when we get into the production facility discussion. Because this takes on a whole new meaning, like Steve Rick said. You know, this is anything like that we deal with right now. We deal with facilities on the water, pipelines by the water. So now we're going into where there's production facilities. There's 438 or something production facility companies, and that's a lot. And there's lots of companies that have 1 or 2 wells, let's say, and there's one company that has 32,000 wells. So it's really all over the map. So we need some discussion about waters of the state, and maybe at the end with the wrap up we can have some talk about waters of the state and what that means as far as the definition goes. Okay, here's if you weren't here this morning, this is my blanket facility or blanket plan slide, and you can read it. It really helps tank vessels and non-tank vessels that do the same kind of business be under one plan. And then they just, because it's the same OSRO, the same kind of response resources, they go into the same area. This, for the wells, might work. This is a concept that we're going to throw out to you folks about a blanket plan. And planning for the largest reasonable worst case spill in our example hydrological region. So they would plan on the wall. If you look over on this one right here, this map right here that our wonderful GIS folks put together, we extracted out of the 438 companies or whatever, we established some criteria. There's a less than 1 barrel producers that don't have to submit a plan. We drew the line at less than 5 barrels. So 5 barrels and greater have to submit a contingency plan. That's just a starting point. What it did is reduced our numbers down from 400 to 200. These are the people that actually pose lots of risk or more risk than the smaller companies. And that was just a starting point to see. We could change that to 3 barrels or 2 barrels or leave it at 1 barrel and gather all those plan holders in there. But what we did is we took out, on this map, we decided, okay, let's just look at the 5 barrels or greater and put those on a map. And you can see that this area right here for production facilities, we identified their...
Chris, I got it right here.
Oh, thank you, Danny. We identified their reasonable worst case. Now, if this well operator right here has a reasonable worst case in this area, and they're within a region or area, then all the wells around them in that area will be covered in a blanket plan. They pull the same stuff out of the ground, they're similar.
So that's what you're looking at as a definition of a production facility. The upstream people kind of know what that is.
So in my mind, I think a production facility is somebody that pulls oil out of the ground like in a well. I know there's facilities, and totally not the expert, totally, and really just, that's why we want you to provide us feedback, because we're where
You're not dealing with, what happens with a drilling facility that keeps fuel on site?
we've also addressed that, because the SPCC and the 1960 plans already look at that, right? So there's already some criteria. These people have to submit and these people don't have to submit. And that's really where we're trying to find a happy medium. You store over so many barrels or you pump so many barrels per day.
So we have 5 barrels.
Well, that's just a starting point. No,
Here's your concept.
Concept.
remember?
4.5 barrels is okay?
4.5
Gary?
No, 4.5 barrels, you don't have to have a plan. That's a concept.
Think about it, think that through. I mean,
5
so
barrels.
their worst case discharge is gonna be somewhat less than 5 barrels, I would presume. Unless they can't get there and turn it off for a week.
Yep,
But,
maybe they don't go by it for a week.
but then what does that mean as far as requirements go? Is that, so they'll have to be prepared for, let's say a 5 barrel spill, is that what you're looking at is?
5 barrels are greater, they submit a contingency plan, and then they have to have some response times around that. We haven't really, and I'll show you what the response times are. We've looked at the marine side, so that's a little different from the rail. So the daily recovery rates, and I'm going to get to those.
But it still has to have threat to surface water.
Thank you.
I mean, if you had a well out in the middle of the Mojave Desert.
Yep.
And you're pumping oil out or you're storing it on site, it doesn't have threat to non-groundwater, right? You're not dealing with groundwater.
Right. Where's the Mojave Desert? Somewhere out here?
Yeah.
A little farther.
This way?
Farther east.
South. Down here? Okay. So, yeah, there's gonna be, some of these aren't gonna impact waters of the state. Well, you can see that Randy put that map up, so, a large portion of these probably will, but there's gonna be, when we craft the emergency regulations and we put them out on the streets, your facility's gonna have to look at those and see if you need to comply with.
So what about dry creeks? Say like the Kern River.
That is waters of the state currently.
Ryan, waters of the state, dry creeks and blue line.
Yes. I mean, so the department has for stream bed alteration purposes, the department stream, and that includes water courses that may have intermittent flow.
Such as seasonal.
Yes. And there's plenty of case law that also makes that same definition. So then there's the issue of if you spill there, it's dry at the time. It's probably not going to be your spill, it's probably not going to travel too far, hopefully, compared to when there's water there. You still have to go clean it up, because once the water does show up in the rain, then it's going to get carried,
Or it's going to go into the ground.
or into the ground.
It's something we need.
Correct, but that's the water jurisdiction. We're staying in our lane, we're not going to the water course. Does that help?
Sort of.
So,
What?
there's a rule of thumb, and I
Here, wait, this is a very complex issue, because now, the enactment of Michigan Game Code section 89.1 refers to the water code, which says state water is surface water or groundwater. And the question would be, should we apply some of that case law that Ryan just mentioned about stream bed alteration cases where courts have held that if you muck around in a stream, the definition of stream is now, doesn't have to have water in it, it can be intermittent. Do we apply that same concept to spill requirements for our purposes? That's a very difficult question, and that's one that we're trying to get an answer.
do we need a work group?
No.
Not
Just so
well, it is a legal question, and of course, if you take one position or the other, you're subject to some kind of review by
No, but again, Terry, remember why it is that we are here. We are here to take a look at contingency planning requirements.
So,
Right, so everything that we talk about with respect to this, I mean, there's what happens during response, there's, all those other things, but again, this gets back to contingency plan requirements for industry folks, planning for reasonable worst case spills, and equipment.
So this is another issue, the coordination with EPA and how they're
Right.
interpreting FRP requirements as far as plume flow
Right,
and how that addresses their vulnerability.
right. And we've started some of those conversations with them.
Because that has a different implication.
But should a plan holder whose facility is next to a dry wash, and it's a dry wash for 5 years, or is it a dry wash 6 months out of the year? I mean, those are the kinds of questions, is that should you plan, you have to have a contract for an operator to respond to the spill if your wash has got water in it, say half of the year. Those are the kinds of questions that.
So I don't, and I see lots of hands going up on this, okay? So I think it's okay to spend time on this, obviously, but if there are specific comments having to do with how it is that you feel, if there is room for interpretation of waters of the state, what you think that might be, we are happy to take those. Okay, no. So shake your head no. Okay.
And it's not interpretation, just kind of direction is that we have facilities that are under 1960 and SPCC already.
Right.
And those stuff is already defined. Is that the universe?
So we looked at those. You know, the SPCC is self-reporting. So if you're close to the water that you think you're going to significantly impact, and I think the rule of thumb is maybe a quarter mile to a blue line, whatever that means. You know, that's the USGS topographical map. You submit an SPCC plan. We're getting copies of those, and we're getting copies of the 1960 plans, which is really a template. It's a fill in the blank. It's kind of where we hope to be with a streamlined plan, or getting where we need to be in the long run, long term, but we're not there yet. We have these new requirements that we have to impose on a new entity, the production facilities, and I think we can get there because a lot of that information is already out there. We don't want it again. God forbid we don't want it again. We just want to get the parts that we've been talking about here, identifying the reasonable worst case, the sensitive site habitat and all that, the parts that really mean a lot to Congressman.
So yes, please.
I think I'd just like to kind of put out there that for those that you're going to be overseeing the contingency plan, that any other plans that aren't water-based but still are for the same industry also be kind of coordinated, because we run into this with levee failure all the time.
Absolutely.
Where levees that protect over 5,000 are required to submit this one report, but their next door neighbor are not, so they're not prepared to respond in any way. So, and it's a problem.
Okay, getting plan holders to care and submit plans is, that's what we do.
And you
Right.
had a comment? Yes.
Chris, it's almost like a scale problem issue. You mentioned you're putting a threshold at 5 barrels per day per well
That's a
location, or
concept,
facility
yeah.
location.
Yep.
Cuts the number of companies down to 200.
Yep.
So the scale is just 48,000 producing wells
Right.
currently in California. That would be all of them, and they produce on average 10 barrels per day. So I see what you did, you went into it down a little bit. That's a lot of locations for a lot of companies to try to figure out if they're going to be close to some blue line. Is it possible for you guys actually to maybe help that process by providing where those stream or blue lines are, and let them do their GIS comparative and say, yeah, I fall within those or not?
So we'll take the comment. I'm not a geographer. Maybe Randy does, but
We have maps.
Okay.
We have GIS maps. We can maybe crank out some maps and help identify those
Right.
areas.
We'll take a look
Yeah,
at
no, that's a great idea. That would surely help the plan holder.
yes.
I'd also recommend that you, for the areas that's referenced to dry washes, dry creeks, that you look at the database set up for the power plant locations in the state that are
Okay.
referenced by sensitive species, so this is a BLM,
Okay.
your agency is involved in some of this.
Right.
Interconnection. Basically, they're mapping all these areas in Kern County, mostly the desert areas. But
Could you get that,
a lot
George?
of them.
I'm sorry, you said that again.
Just
So
some
you-
information to help determine where.
Oh, where it is. So I'm just going to rephrase what you said so Joy can catch it. You suggested that we take a look at the maps generated for power plant regulation generated by BLM that actually identifies some of those dry creek beds and any of a number of other areas and sensitive species
So,
associated with
The
that.
most sensitive is desert tortoise.
Okay,
Who is
Excellent.
the keeper of the database?
I think BLM, it's an interagency group with BLM.
well, and I coordinate with BLM in the regional response team, so that would be a good place for us to start. Okay, one last quick question, Dawn, before Chris can move on. Yeah.
I know at the federal level, the designation of what is regulatory water for an oil spill was a very litigious process.
Right.
It will be for this as well. So I would assume that that answer is not going to come that clearly.
Fair enough. Okay. Okay, Chris.
Okay, so this is a blanket plan concept, and it's out there for discussion. Timeframes we already talked about. I'm not going to talk about them again. We already talked about this. The one thing that I do want to spend a little more time on this slide is the drills and exercise. Like the daily recovery rates that are tiered from the reasonable worst case spill volume, the hours, there's also this concept of if you're a smaller production facility or you're a facility operator that has one well, Bud's pumping service, he has 2 wells, he impacts spring waters, he has to submit a plan. But he only impacts dry creeks, and he still has to submit a plan for approval. It still needs to be tested, but is there ways that we can look at reducing the objectives, right? Reducing the number of hoops that he has to jump through to get his plan tested, because like on the marine side, we have the smaller marine fueling facilities. We've reduced their objectives down. We took away the in situ burning, and we reduced it down, and maybe Andy can speak a little to that, but we did a real good job of making it more realistic on what they actually do. Scale down the objectives for them, and that might be something that this concept of looking at reduced drills and exercises or making it more realistic. They still have to have a plan. They still have to do the initial planning P, initial leg of the planning P, but some of these objectives that Andy, go ahead. I know words just want to come flow out of your mouth.
I was thinking just more than necessarily reducing the objectives, but scaling the expectations back a little bit, and just making it more appropriate to their skill potential and the resources that they have, and the risk.
Right. Thank you.
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Maybe use the Homeland Security exercise definitions. So a smaller agency is only responsible for a drill or a seminar, but larger agencies have to go through functional or full scale.
That's a great idea.
Did you get that, Joy?
And we should be in step with that anyway, and using the same lingo and all that, and we've been kind of like this, but I know the EPA and the Coast Guard are starting to talk a little more Homeland HC, but DESI is starting to talk a little bit more HC.
For the drills, you're still going to require 1 tabletop per year with a 3-year cycle of addressing all of the objectives.
So for vessels, we just changed that recently. Thanks, Dale. Yeah, no, we haven't talked about that. Facilities can do them throughout contested objectives as long as they get them all tested within a 3-year period. We changed the requirement for vessels to have them all done at one time. And that really kind of focuses in on these contracted spill management teams that come in and, we need to look at those folks do it all at one time instead of doing it piecemeal, where that really wasn't it. That's where we need to be. So to answer your question is, I think we're going to just be in step with what the small marine fueling facility requirement now is, and that's being able to do them throughout the 3-year cycle. The objectives, whatever we come up with.
And is each drill going to require state participation? And federal, for that matter.
Well, we want somebody participating, and we want somebody to evaluate and making sure, right? So, Yvonne talked about that. As long as there's somebody there and you're being evaluated, and we not trust that agency, but we, we're
So another way to think about that is you've heard us say that we understand that we are moving into a framework that exists already, whether it's with EPA or DOG or Fire Marshal, OES, local OES, other local governments. A lot of those folks participate in drills and exercises as well. So it may be that we talk about amongst the agencies ourselves, what kinds of objectives do we want to have done in sort of the broad sense. And if somebody goes to one of those drills, like if we go to one of them and EPA isn't able to go, we can say, well, this is what they covered. This is what we think is fine. And we could develop that on the agency side. So it may be an MOU, it may be just an understanding, it may be any of a number of other things. But it's important for us as a regulating agency to be able, and I would assume it's important for industry as well, to have an independent party say, you guys did a good job on this drill and we're going to get credit for it. Or otherwise it's a lot of self-attestation, and that doesn't work for anybody on the long run on either side.
And then 200 new plan holders.
Yeah, that's exactly. So yeah, it's probably 250, might be 300, depending where we put that cutoff. But yeah, so we have to, prioritize what we're going to focus on, and that's.
And we're rolling this out, right? So we're all learning this as we go along together. So hold on one second, Bill. So I want to make sure that industry folks have the opportunity to say the things that they need to say. So Annie, and then Bill, and then we'll see where we are.
Yeah, just really quick in response to that question. Right now we require for the drills and exercises we do a marine trial that the state is invited to the drill, and that we have the required 60-day notice for an exercise. And then for credit, on the credit end, even if we don't show up, that doesn't mean you can't get credit, but we need everything documented. We need all the documentation for that. So we would make every effort to attend every drill, but just because we're not there doesn't mean it's not going to be eligible.
Excellent. Thank you for the clarification, Annie. Yes, Bill.
Yeah, I just want to say from EPA's perspective that this is, as it's already been pointed out, this is an onerous task you have ahead of you. We've been doing it, trying to do it for many, many years, because you have more resources than us now. And that there are a lot of lessons learned, and nothing's perfect. And, you talk about AT, Homeland Security Exercise Evaluation Program. You also talk about the federal government's training and exercise program policy, TAP, that you can't improve it and you can't measure it. You can't imagine, you can't measure it. The target capabilities list, and, what are the gaps, and how do you improve it? I can tell you right now, that'll never happen with all these plan holders unless you've got an army of people out there working with them almost every day. So to really get to the nitty-gritty about what's important, we do look at where the vulnerabilities are. We look at where the hazards are. We don't just choose places willy-nilly. We look at where the biggest, the most disastrous impact or most likely scenarios could happen before we pick and choose things very carefully.
Right.
And ultimately it's going to come down to that, because that's what's important.
Right.
And so no matter what you put together, and we're going to be working with you, we all know, we're already working with you,
Right.
and we have, and we will, and we've worked together for many, many years. And, depending upon who you have and your resources, people, and how you put it together, really determine how successful your ultimate goal is. And I think we all know that the reasonableness of it all will really come down to money and resources. And that whatever you write, let's just hope that it really is implementable. And I'm confident, having worked with all of you in many years, that it will be. So, but I think all the comments are fabulous. We'd love to see a better regulatory program out there, because we cannot do it alone. We're really glad to see you doing it.
Thank you. So, and this is also where we, again, are also mindful of our other counterparts, whether it's with Dogger or State Fire Marshal, people who are already out there at the state level as well as at the federal level doing some of this work already. So that's the opportunity for us to integrate more with them on drills and exercises. It's something that's really important, as well as training, which you heard me talk about this morning. So any other? Okay.
Okay, so we're going to blast through a couple more slides here. This afternoon session talks about production facilities and pipelines. You got a little glimpse of the pipeline reasonable worst case spill. Not going to go over this again. So I'm going to show you some proposed reasonable worst case spills for why, already did that one, already gave you an example of what we, so here's a proposed production facility reasonable worst case scenario. 2 times the daily production average, 3 times the daily production average. Go ahead and ask me, where did I come up with that?
Where'd you come up
I don't have any idea. This is so the 3 times is already an existing reasonable case bill for production facilities. That's a requirement, and I don't really remember where it's a requirement, but 3 times a daily production facility average. This is back to just a number, right? So it's not the end-all be-all. It's just what somebody decided as a good reasonable worst-case bill. You know, is 2 times enough? 3 times, 4 times? And that's kind of what we want to talk about. It's like, why should we use 3 times? And I think a work group could really flesh that out. Use an existing reasonable worst-case bill for a production facility already, and then what is that going to require that plan holder to contract with to really meet this reasonable worst-case bill volume? You know, what's the cost to them to have to contract with a rated OSRO to meet 2 times or 3 times the daily average?
So that production facilities, as we were talking about earlier, oil wells, also extends to a whole refinery as a production facility, right?
Does.
So that would be your 3 times would be their throughput of crude oil, as an example.
And we have plans like that. We got informational plans that sent to us that may actually have some like 577,000 barrels reasonable worst case bill volumes.
Just
They're
a
not-
clarifying question, that's all.
Yep, no, that's what it is.
That's
Yep.
the same thing, Chris, that I was gonna deal with. And one of the things here, when we talk about production facilities, one thing we have to flesh out for you guys, I think we need to provide you with what that means.
Sure.
Because we, for example, we went off to 3,200 wells, or 30,000 wells.
Right. Sure.
You don't take 3 times that, I mean.
No. This would be per well.
Yeah, well, but that's just part of a production facility, there's other parts.
Oh,
of the
right,
production
okay,
facility.
understand.
So I think that we need to talk about that. I don't know if this is the right time to talk about it.
No.
It gets back to the, how you're looking at things, and some discussions here, the blue lines, intermediate streams, all that kind of stuff. In the production facility area, there are already plans that are written that may or may not meet all the requirements of this, but pretty darn close, that have a lot of the definitions already in there. We don't want to see new definitions where we're all doing this interpretive thing,
Okay.
when in fact we have plans specifically designed to protect waters of the state.
So under Dogger, is that?
Yeah, right.
Plans under Dogger. I just-
1960 plan.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. So yeah, we're looking at those. We put in our letter, silly us, please submit an informational copy to the administrator. So now we're getting lots of plans. So we have a good idea what these plans look like.
And one of the things I think that's going to be coming after these meetings, obviously, are individual meetings with our other state counterparts. So with Dogger saying, okay, so this is conceptually what we're thinking about in terms of resources at risk and, you know, equipment and reasonable worst case spills. Do we need to come up with an addendum to your plan, right? What do you already have as a production facility definition? What do you already have as this? So that we can make sure that, again, it's value added. It's not people using the same words in a completely different way regulatory-wise, and you guys have no idea whether or not you're complying, and we don't have any idea whether or not you're complying, so.
How we get to this volume right there? Yeah.
Right, that's something that
That's what
we're
we're
interested in
working on.
taking comments on. Steve and then
Yeah,
Don.
in the Marine program, you've got already methodology laid out to determine worst-case bill volume based on off-site consequence analysis and the like. Why wouldn't you use the same approach with this?
We are, for the pipeline. We're going to use the same, how to figure out a reasonable worst-case spill volume for pipelines, marine and inland.
And why wouldn't that apply to a production facility
Well,
or an inland refinery?
Because, well, we kind of talked about that. It's spills to, so it's, we could, don't get me wrong, it's large volumes on the marine side, both for the daily recovery amounts and for the reasonable worst case spill. And I think, like we tried to reduce the number, if we take these smaller plan holders, number one, we don't want them to submit contingency plans too. We don't want to have to make them contract with rated OSROs that basically they can't afford to do. So the whole model doesn't really shift over from the marine facility. And I'll show you that we're using the small marine fueling facility as sort of a model. This isn't one of them, but for the daily recovery rates, it is. It's the same. It's 50%, and you'll see when I get to that slide. But yeah, we looked at that, and all I can tell you right now is because we've had all this time to really look at this. I mean, a month.
Yeah.
We're struggling with, and that's why we need these work groups. That's why we need these scoping sessions. We're really trying to look at what's reasonable.
So Steve, I had Joy capture your comment of, perhaps taking a look at using a similar concept to how we regulate and do reasonable worst case spill for facilities, for inland production facilities. And then that would be sort of that question, right? We need to take a look at it. And again, with some of the comments this morning of really identifying what the differences are between marine and inland and whether or not that concept would continue to make sense. So Don and then Bill and then...
Just two things real quick. One is production facilities are all across the board.
Right.
Stone Age or modern world, they're all across the
Right,
board. But they're all talking the same stuff. They're all making the same stuff. They're all making oil. And they're all approached the same way. It's just a matter of whether you have a shovel or a digital valve. But they're all similar. The problem is they're not all regulated the same way. Some facilities can have pipelines that are small enough so the dogger doesn't regulate them, and they can have a big impact on the environment. Okay, so you're almost stuck with a work group that's production facility specific, and I highly recommend that because
I agree.
that's okay. We're on the same page.
Bill?
Concur with Don, and adding on to that, I'm wondering why are you looking at, go back up one slide please, why you're looking at the annual daily production average when we look at significant harm, substantial significant harm. And to us that makes sense because it's not what they're producing but where it goes and what they're doing with it. Because if they're producing it, it's got to either go into a pipeline or it's got to go into a tank, right? And so it's that pipeline and tank that are going to cause the harm, not how much is produced. So they can produce a lot, but it's going to go somewhere and take from that point because that's where the harm is going to arise.
So maybe...
And I'm wondering, is that because it's written into your law that you have to use production average versus storage and substantial harm?
No, so the reasonable worst case spill is just a number. Right, you understand that. So significant harm, is that a volume? Is that just a yes or no question?
Well, believe it or not, it's based on relationship to vulnerable impacts.
Okay.
In fact, I can read them off to you if you want. Drinking water harm, discharge over a certain amount, inadequate secondary containment, impact fish and wildlife, etc. And this definition, and also transferable water, which is a big one.
Right.
But that really, to us, looks at a realistic potential harm versus just production. Because if it's going to a pipeline, you're going to have your pipeline regs, right? And if it's going to a storage tank, that's where we find some of the biggest problems.
Okay.
Of course, pipelines being the biggest release of oil in the United States, we all know, at least for us. Yeah.
So no, there isn't anything written in law that it needs to be done this way. I will have Joy capture that, and then it will just be one more thing that this production work group needs to take a look at. Yeah, I'm sorry. Steve, did you have a comment? Matt, and then I'll get back to you. So Matt?
I actually, when I looked at this, I had the same question. So it goes back to the definition of production facilities. Whether production facilities is only that pump, or is it the flow line, the tanks and all that? Because if you put that all together, then you get to the definition that Bill just described. And pipeline being flow line could be a part of that. and then maybe even the calculation of how a flow line spills and what's the reasonable worst case could be different than a line that is intrastate or intrastate pipeline.
Okay.
Because the flow line, we talked about
That's
that.
defined, I think.
Pardon?
I'm almost positive the production facility parts are defined somewhere.
Okay, but that's something we can take a look at, right, Chris?
We can.
Yeah,
That would be
absolutely.
great, because
Okay.
that's where we need to be, lines, pipelines, and facilities.
Flow line, gathering line.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
No, we understand.
That's right, Don,
Yeah.
thank you.
So if you put that all together, then that annual daily production average may really lose its meaning and it goes back to just build define.
Yeah,
Because
we're
that's
around
where
that.
you're gonna have problem, not from the well that pumps the oil out, but actually from either that flow line or the gathering line or the storage facility that leaks.
Yeah.
Okay, so Bill, and then over here.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I want to just point back to our significant substantial harm criteria. I think it's pretty much proved in time that prevention program is probably more important than anything else.
Right.
And that by us focusing on the significant substantial harm and storage and pipelines,
Right.
we then get to our prevention program can actually do something about that. We can
Right.
look at what it takes to have a storage tank that has integrity. We can't look at whether production is going to go up or down, and that's going to make a difference. So there's a reason for it.
Right, and you all know that as well, also in inland, not just for planning, but we also have sister agencies that do prevention side of that as well. And we will be coordinating significantly with that to make sure that we are, if we have additional requirements, that they are additive, right, that they are value added. And if indeed those requirements are sufficient from our perspective by those other agencies, then we will utilize those requirements as well. So that's something that goes on there as well. Yes, please.
Yeah, Chris, I was going to ask you, so do you anticipate an entity putting a contingency plan, let's say they're a refinery, they would have an element that would cover their incoming and outgoing pipeline connections. They would have a separate element for the refinery itself, per your example of production, annual daily production, possibly. And then they would have a separate element for all of their storage tanks as another element. Is that what you're envisioning?
So currently, they're different plans, and I think I see where you're going. Are they going to be separate plans, separate, is that what you're asking?
Or all part of the same, because
All the same, all the same.
the
We-
volume is.
The
very
reasonable worst
significant
case-
In the storage, it's
Thank
more
you.
than double the example
Thanks,
you
Marty.
gave.
Yep.
Yeah.
Where their largest reasonable worst case spill is in that one area, whatever we call it, whatever that company has around there is covered. And they're going to contract with an OSRO that can meet all of the needs of the pipeline. We do that now with tank vessels and non-tank vessels. A company will have a tank vessel, 25% of the total car capacity. They can put all the non-tanks they want into it as long as they have an OSRO that can meet the tank vessel, 25% of the total car capacity, right? MSRC will cover a plan. They can cover both the tank and the non-tank. Doesn't matter what the entity is in that, as long as they have enough coverage, response resources to meet that within the ACP area. But that's a good point, thank you.
So other questions or comments at this point? I'm also mindful of time, it's close to 3 o'clock, so maybe as Chris works his way through the reasonable worst case spill, I think it would, I'm assuming that people would welcome a break soon-ish? Okay. Go ahead, Chris. Soon-ish, I know.
Not going to change my story. This is the facilities, and I just looked at the regs. Facilities and pipelines are basically figured the same. It talks about loss of the entire line, shutdown, and all that. That's how we address reasonable worst case spills on the pipeline side, and the facility is all about this. Or do the math, or just do this. I'm this. It's just daily recovery rates, we talked a lot about daily recovery rates this morning. So production facilities. This is another concept that we're going to throw out. It mirrors the small marine fueling facility requirement that we have on the marine side, which basically says you have your reasonable worst case spill volume, 2 hours we want you to contain and recover 50%, respond to, and then another 12 hours, another 50%. This is a reality on the marine side. It's a concept on the production facility side. You're shaking your head.
No.
Yeah.
You're going to say something.
Well, I think it's a totally different set of environmental conditions too.
Agreed. No, I agree, we don't have any argument here, this is just a proposed,
Let's you have to start with 12 instead of 2. How's that? Same concept too.
So
I like it,
again,
but your plant holders probably are gonna like when their oil goes everywhere.
Well, that's,
You know, they're gonna want something that gets the stuff there quicker, right? Either they do it themselves or they contract with an OSRO that has equipment pre-positioned. But yeah, these are plan holder requirements.
and again, you know, these are concepts, analogous, at least conceptually, to what we have in the marine environment. You've already heard us say it many times, that we appreciate that the inland environment is not identical to the marine environment by any means. And so I think part of the discussion that we had this morning is why Chris and Tom and Ryan came up with maybe we need to have work groups. And so this would be one of those work groups, right? Taking a look at reasonable worst case spill and what that means for effective daily recovery rates, right? What do we mean by capacity and what those timeframes look like? So please.
So you get a refinery that puts out, I'm not a refinery guy, 50,000 barrels a day.
Okay.
In 2 hours, you want to be able to recover 25,000 barrels?
So I guess the question is, what is that person's reasonable worst case spill based on that volume? So whatever the
If
volume
it's 2 or
is.
3 times, then it's even worse than that.
You
Yep.
don't use that thing.
Yep, you don't, and you can't. So this won't work for that. That's a good point.
Right.
I mean, or you're gonna have to pre-position a lot of people and equipment in that area to respond within 2 hours.
Well, and that's the other way to look at it is, as an OSRO, you'd have to get to every one of those little dots in 2 hours.
Or just the one big dot with all the wells around it. You'd have to get to the big dot. Right? We're not going to respond to all the dots, we're going to respond to the big reasonable worst case
All the
dot.
dots have got the requirements, so.
They do, but see, on a blanket plan, they'll be just, yes, I appreciate that.
So Steve, if from your perspective, from the OSRO perspective, that there's something in this concept that doesn't hold true for you, doesn't hold water for you, no pun intended, then that is something, that is the feedback that we need to get. Is it the concept that is problematic? Is it the time frame that's problematic? Is it the percentages that are problematic? Or is the whole thing problematic?
So-
Right? Hold on for a second.
So, Yvonne and Chris, and I'm talking from a producer's perspective, I just want to make sure I'm not confused. because
Okay.
I'm getting more confused. Right now, there are plans for oil spill responses and production facilities. And when I hear some of this stuff, I'm concerned that I don't know what your knowledge and exposure to those plans are. Because the more we talk, it seems like it's less than.
Haven't had time to review all the different agencies, federal and state.
So I think what's going to happen, you know, we have these discussions, and what Steve brought up is going right to that point. I think that quickly as that knowledge comes forward, and what we've committed to for the production part of this is to provide a model plan, in other words, something that kind of represents as much as we can.
Right.
With nuances, answer some of these questions, because what I would ask is, if I have a 1960 plan in place and certified, is that acceptable? Does that meet your needs? Well, I don't know if it does.
Parts of it will.
Yeah, parts of it will, exactly. And that's where we need to get to. And maybe some of these questions will fall off the table as we go forward, because this is the type of slide that I go, oh my, you know,
You're gonna have some-
we're not going to be happy with this.
You're going to have some stricter, maybe some stricter response timeframes. They're going to be in step with what's already out there. There might be a 6-hour, there might be a 12-hour response timeframes. Tiered, I think, is what they're called in the federal world, right? Tiered responses.
Well, you've got some in yours. Your marine.
Cascading.
Well, yeah, we have.
Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 requirements.
Right.
So, yeah, you're right, we don't. And this was just thrown up there for, for a concept to generate, right?
Okay. So as long as we're on the same page.
Oh, absolutely. No, we are not here to try to convince you that this is just what's on the marine side of the house.
And another item that's kind of related to this is OSRO. Inland, we don't particularly have OSROs, and you heard a lot of this, is that agencies are part of the response versus with our classic Osra, you know, and I think that will also come out of reviewing these plans that are in existence now, so you'll see how you have to kind of modify this
Okay.
Osra reading kind of concept. as you
Okay.
go in there.
Well, that's great. I mean, I'm not committing to saying that we're going to do that or not do that, but that is the reason of these scoping sessions, is to get a better handle on what we don't know and what we don't understand, and what concepts won't easily move over lock, stock, and barrel, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we don't want to move them over because they don't fit like the production facilities or anything.
Nobody wants something that doesn't work. But,
Thank you. So, that was really terrible. Tom already talked about this. Same deal. Same deal. Same deal. And we talked a little bit about this and the drill credit and giving drill credit for other federal and state drills, reducing the amount of objectives, not reducing, but requiring less. And I don't know what the right word is, but working with our federal and state counterparts to
scalable was the word I used.
Scalable.
Scalable.
We're still going to do unannounced drills. Do them jointly, do them separately. There's unannounced drills will still happen. We still have spill management teams on the marine side. You figure that have been doing spill management for a while now that still can't manage a spill. So we still have problems there. We're still going to keep doing unannounced drills, mainly with the feds and the state, and we're not going to do redundancy. We're going to focus on the ones that need to get done.
Okay.
And the summary is yours.
Right, and we've done a lot of it sort of along the way, right? We've talked about reasonable worst case spills, some of the comments that you wanted to have in on the record, and also just that ongoing discussion. So I'm going to ask, I know everybody wants to take a break, so my question for the group generally, and just to kind of shout out, are there still more issues that you want to capture with respects to anything that's on this list? OSRO, sensitive sites, drills, tiered approach to volume and risk, reasonable worst case spill that we haven't already covered. This is sort of a yes or no. Or conceptually more ideas of what it is that we're thinking about. I'm sort of seeing no's, but there may be yeses. Okay, because my suggestion is going to be, let's take a 15-minute break. We will come back. Let me see what time it is right now. Okay. So it's 5 after 3. We'll come back at 20 after, and then we will pick up either with this, and if there's anything still outstanding with this, and if not, then we will move on to the certificates of financial responsibility. Excellent. Contingency planning. I just wanted to make sure before we moved over to the covert concepts, as we're talking about production facilities and pipelines, if there is anything outstanding that wasn't either covered in concept this morning or this afternoon having to do with any of the information that Chris presented. So I'm just going to run down the list, and I'm going to say once, twice, done, move on to the next one. Reasonable worst case spill volumes. Once. Steve, you thinking?
Well,
You're
I think
thinking.
it does need some further discussion. I don't know that you're going to be able to get your arms around
Fair enough.
all the details of it, but I
Okay.
think it is very, very important to get that right.
Okay, so can you just sketch that in the notes, Joy? Okay. Daily recovery rates?
Same thing.
Same thing,
That,
right.
and I think such a big part of that is when Chris said, well, your customers are going to want you to be there in 2 hours with on-water recovery. And if I showed up with a skimming vessel and a boom out in Taft,
Right.
You'd
be laughed off the site.
Like I'm crazy. So
Yeah.
we need to understand what we need to bring to the party.
Okay.
I would like to see that.
Yeah, I bet you would.
Trying to see it happen like it.
Okay. So sensitive site protection, I know we had a lot of discussion about that this morning. Is there any additional discussion or any additional concept or clarification? Going once? Twice? Okay. Finally, drills. Going once? Twice? Okay. So the next presentation, you know us all now by now. Mike Zamora will come back up and talk about COFRs, so certificates of financial responsibility, as it relates to our thinking of production facilities and pipelines.
Thank you.
And I'm going to go get some more caffeine because I obviously need caffeine.
Looks like we weeded out a lot of people. So I know I went over this earlier.
Because they know that you already covered everything so well this morning, Mike.
We got Chris. Okay, we know what a COFR is. I don't know if there's anybody around that wasn't here this morning, but just really quickly. So, of course, there's an application process. Yes, go ahead.
Preliminarily, I think this definition is really good for that question this morning about who needs to get the COFR. Should it be, for example, we're talking about rail. Does the railroad and the owner of the oil have to get COFR? And this basically clarifies that. It's owner or operator.
Okay, right. So we'll be taking an application, but it could be from either or, and there could be an agreement between both companies.
Exactly right.
Right, so whoever's applying for the COFRs, we're assuming is accepting financial responsibility. Thanks, Steve. Okay, earlier I also went over what we currently issue COFRs for, tankers, non-tanks, and of course facilities. What we're talking about now is, of course, we're already issuing COFRs for pipelines and production wells and facilities. And we did go over the coverage amounts earlier. 300 million maximum for marine facilities. And we're assuming that's going to stay in place. Okay, we have no reason to really look at that differently, but of course we are looking at it, the maximum that is. Okay, and then we get there by doing our calculation, the per barrel calculation, the reasonable worst case spill volume. Again, we went over that. Chris looks at different aspects. We calculate the per barrel fee multiplied by the largest reasonable worst case spill volume. Okay, so I just put a little example on here to show this is a current company we have that has several different types of COFRs. Well, they have several different types of facilities. Let me rephrase that. So, for example, this one has a drilling platform, and the drilling platform, of course, we're looking at barrels, has 14,321 barrels. And they also have a pipeline at 15,000 barrels. So, of course, we're only concerned with the largest, okay? No matter what they have. In this scenario, using our 12,500 per barrel cost, multiplying that by 15,000, they have a financial responsibility of $187,500,000. Okay? I just want to show that example. And of course, we did go over the COFR options for meeting that financial requirement. And I don't know if anybody's really interested in this or if you want me to elaborate on any of it, but of course, the insurance and self-insurance is a standard way they use for meeting financial requirement. Okay, so, and to summarize.
So this is back where we started. So input and question from you all based on what Mike presented having to do with reasonable worst case spill and COFR requirements for production facilities, caffeine hasn't kicked in yet, production facilities or pipelines. I'm hearing crickets here. Are people still alive? Okay, good. Okay, and I know that there was a lot of comments this morning. I know Steve provided comments. I know lots of folks provided comments about what per barrel cleanup cost really looks like in inland and what are we really talking about. You know, are we talking about oil cleanup? Are we talking about fire? What is it that we're really talking about? So I think we got a lot of those comments. I just wanted to know if there was anything additional folks wanted clarification on or that folks wanted to add with respects to the information Mike just covered? Going once, twice. All right.
Thank you, guys.
So at this point, this concludes. I mean, I can go through what I went through this morning, right? So next steps for us. I mean, obviously we have work groups that are going to be meeting. And so please make sure that on the sign-in sheet you identify what work groups you are interested in participating in, correct? Or are we doing it differently?
No, we're doing the same way. It's the north and the south thing too, so we have to really kind of, if you have a preference on whether it's north or south,
Okay,
that would help.
right.
Most hopefully people will say north up here, but
Now, yes, Steve?
there's,
Well, I'm just thinking.
Don't think out loud.
If we want to have a north and a south, I mean, if you've got a consistent group of people who formulate,
Right, we'll take a look at it.
and then you're going to go a different group, some in the state.
right.
Well-
The magic of the webinar and all that stuff, we're gonna try to utilize, so we don't,
Excellent.
our travel and, is.
Right,
so
we don't want to
spend
have,
some time doing what we're supposed to do for a living.
right, we don't want to have 12 different work groups where there's 2.5 people on each work group, right? That's not going
Right, we
to
want-
get us to where we need to be.
If you have a preference, let us know, and we'll factor that all in.
I think for
Tom, yes.
production, it'd be okay to have it here.
Okay.
Because most of our production's in the valley, not in Bakersfield.
We'll go to Bakersfield.
In August,
We
yeah,
are not afraid of
awesome.
Bakersfield. I want that to be
Maybe you'll
known.
love it.
There's some people that actually grew up in Bakersfield.
Does this look like I would be a Bakersfield baby? Okay, so unless there are other comments that people want to make for the good of the order, thank you so much for your presence here, for your honesty, for helping us try and craft a better product. Again, we will be staying if you want to make comments to myself or somebody else in the group sort of offline. And we look forward to continuing this dialogue. This is just the beginning of an ongoing dialogue that we've had the benefit of enjoying for 23 years on the marine side, and we hope to have the same cooperation on the inland side as we establish a statewide program. Anything else from the gang? Chris? Joy?
Thank you.
Oh, how about a hand to our note taker? He's probably still on Alaska time. So thank you all very much. Yes, Tom, sorry.
I'm gonna post these presentations.
We will post the presentation on our website, yes.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Along with the notes once we vet them.
right, absolutely.
And all those boundaries and outlines you saw in IRMA is all available to you on the internet through the IRMA website.
Excellent.
Just do a search Southwest IRMA, no login required.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much.
All right.
So Chris,